Alright, Gurguit V. Now you will know the meaning of true suffering from Gold Paladin. Huh? Prominence Glare. It's been so long. Ah, I remember the good old times with Gold Paladin. Wait a minute. I think there was a card that we don't really talk about anymore. Oh yeah. What was that card?
We don't talk about you. No.
So Bluish Flames. G format. Let's dive right into it. So specifically G format ended up lasting to 2018. This is before V series cards, so think about gift generation like Force, Excel, and Protect. Those did not existed yet. Plus the power triggers were 5k instead of 10k, with only 10k shield and the rest of grade 2s and grade 1s being 5k. Memorable decks are like Bermuda Triangle, Shurnuri with Dominate at the time, Brave, Chronojet, Angel Geese, and a bunch of other decks as well. So it's been quite a few years, and so what's brought back doing a G format deck? There's a community Discord such as the G Reboot server that was initially by Ty Smith, but Caleb is now running the server for the most part, and with some help as well with some other players within the community Discord as well. What's also cool about this is they have a modified ban list too. Examples are Rin at 2, Balam at 2 for Dark Irregulars, and a couple other ones too that I'll mention on the screen too. Thanks to this modified ban list, it's made a lot of tier 2 decks basically playable in this format as well. Bluish Flames being one of them, and having the opportunity to go back to that era and actually mess with the latest Gold Paladin support from back then. Gurguit outshined pretty much Bluish Flames, especially once it got its new support in the same set with Gurguit Helios. Not to mention Garmor coming out of nowhere as well earlier. But the deck's main focus is access to guard restriction, with either going critical with Prominence Glare or having quad check with Gurguit Helios. As mentioned with the intro, we've seen Bruno as well to make power Vanguard columns as well, but he could also be a big booster for Rigard columns if needed to. Since the deck's core is Legion era base, it has a lot of skills that are actually available to us to basically turn 2 to have a better early game compared to Generation Break decks in this format. In fact, if you have a more pure Generation Break deck, you'll realize that you're basically playing vanillas until you eventually stride. For standard players, that might be weird, especially if you did start with the standard era, usually used to cards being able to do stuff. But in this era, you really had to play till strides to really do something with your cards. So any decks that have some early game in this G era had some type of advantage as well, with that being said. Furthermore, this deck has access to strength like Ultima, Glory's Reigning Dragon as well, and other generic Gold Paladin support. This is where actually even G0s such as Slamy really started shining. Check out Dueling Guard's deck boxes, playmats, and binders. The great quality products that are anime based. They continually have more anime options becoming available. Use the affiliated link in the description for a 5% discount on your next purchase. Starting off with the grade 3s, we were playing 4 copies of Prominence Glare, so this is Explosion Blue to its max. 9 times out of 10, you honestly aren't going to do this turn with Legion and using Counterblast and discarding a lot of Bluish Flames. You typically will go into the Gurguit Helios play because 1, it's more safer, it's easier to do, and it's also just very advantageous to keep up the pressure too. But if you feel like you need to one-shot somebody from like 4 damage or even 3 damage, this could be an option too. Or you're not able to stride, you can at least Legion and return triggers such as crits, heals, and other combo pieces that Gold Paladin will need to Superior Call anyway from the deck. Also, do note that there's certain clans that actually have access to G-Guards that make it easier to guard against Glare too. So that's another reason why you prefer going into Gurguit Helios, unless you for sure you can actually push through with the Prominence Glare at that point too. The other things to worry about is like Royal Paladin can actually Superior Call a grade 1 PG to be able to perfect guard. You could also, with the Grand Blue with Negronora, also reviving old school PGs, being able to also perfect guard that way too, to get around it. Remember, in G era, to that point, perfect guards were grade 1s. So that's why grade 1s or greater guard restrictions were very powerful during this time and even before. But it has gotten weaker because of the G-Guards like I mentioned, and then of course now in Futures Modern Age as well. Playing 4 copies of Percival, so you could play the other Bluish Flame, which is Prominence Core too if you want to, but I went with Percival because just in case you need to Superior Call a field, essentially, he's free. Prominence Core and Prominence Glare use Counterblast too, and then if some of your strides already use Counterblast with the exception of Gurguit Helios, there's no effective way for us to countercharge with the exception of the heal trigger too. So Counterblast is pretty limiting at that point. So Percival is really just free in that sense too. This really doesn't come up as often too, essentially because even if you had the option to Legion into a worse Legion, you're better off just striding. 4 copies of our boy Oath Liberator Aglovale. So this is phenomenal, especially in its time. Counterblast 1, check top 3, and call Liberator. This is essentially the gold version of Banon with Marin, where you're able to +2 in the field, get some of hand advantage at that point too. But of course, you have a little bit of variance of what you superior call from the deck. This card also in the stride turns can not only help build a field, but it also really activates Unite if you think about it. Call this from hand and then you call something else, boom, you call 2 units already. Furthermore, this can call itself actually and keep chaining more superior calls that way too. So you can start stacking up Brunos as well. He's also the Legion mate for Percival as well. Then his alter ego Regulation Liberator Aglovale. And so this is the Legion mate for Glare. And it's also really useful because he's an 11k beater if you have a Bluish Flame Vanguard, which you do. And then when you superior call from deck, you can Soul Blast generically to check the top 5 for a Bluish Flame. This helps feed fodder for Prominence Glare's skill to be able to go Explosion Blue, but also just have stride fodder. Or if you need to call like another body as a rear guard, you can call at least an 11k grade 3 at that point. 3 copies of Magnus, and so this is a phenomenal card because essentially it's a free version of Oath Liberator Aglovale. Not to mention that this lets you call over rearguard circles that have rearguards on top of them as well. Aglovale is restricted to open rearguard circles. This card checks for cards in the Vanguard circle, and so that includes the heart. And so if you're on Solemn Glitter, which is a Liberator stride, and your heart is also a Liberator, it counts as 2 cards on the Vanguard circle. So Magnus will work on the first stride turn with Solemn Glitter. Worst case scenario, you'll be in the Legion state, which already has 2 Vanguard cards that are Liberators on the Vanguard circle too, making them live. There are other phenomenal options too, such as like Bernarius that lets you basically countercharge potentially if you do hit. He also stacks up on power too, which I can see the argument if you want to go that route, but then I feel like you would have to account for other cards that help superior calling more in the grade 1s as well. And I'll cover that once I get to that point. There's also like generic GB1 Liberator support we did get, but I feel like those cards also like use a resource like a Counterblast and a Soul Blast, so where Magnus is just free. And you can keep calling them with like Catch Call and other Aglovale cards. There's also flexibility with this card because if you call a Bluish Flame, the grade 3s, you can add it to your hand actually. So this further helps with stride fodder, but also the Bluish Flame Explosion Blue strategy too. So he just has a lot of utility compared to the other grade 2s, but you're more than welcome to tweak to your preference. 4 copies of the PG that's a Liberator, but also improved Falcon. It has a skill that's really useful. So if you have 2 of them in the drop zone, you could essentially return up to 2 rear guards from your field, bottom deck them, and then be able to check the top 3 to call something. This helps you have more superior calls to either A, build a field, but also proc Bruno more times if needed, and also cheer up Trumpeter if you use the ability to have the red tech skill given to your Vanguard as well to further beef it up at this point. You could also play the countercharge PGs too if you feel like counterblast is an issue at that point and you don't necessarily miss this. This is also a Liberator target, just worst case scenario from like Aglovale's for any like Liberator specific top 3 searches too. So you can call this as a booster, worst case scenario. And our boy Bruno. Remember, we don't talk about Bruno. But ultimately, you want to see this card ASAP, and so that's why we play 4 copies. This lets you not have to like really dig deep for the deck for this card when you do need it. You can place it behind the Vanguard just to have a beefy Vanguard column that's really annoying. Again, this is in G era, so you may have some G guards that are there too, but at the end of the day too, G guards can only get so big too. Especially with triggers being so small too, just having a beefier Vanguard column just makes it a lot difficult to guard it essentially, unless it's resulting them on using a PG at that point. This can also have like a back row of multiple Brunos too, so it could also beef up your rear columns too. There's even weird situations where Bruno basically becomes so big by himself, and if you really don't have any like other useful units, he can go into the front row and be an attacker himself too. 3 copies of Josephus. So this is the Liberator that lets you draw into a card. He's very specific. You have to Soul Blast a Liberator too. So you do have some non-Liberators that you may ride into or Soul Charge, but just having enough like 3 copies, and when you do see him, you get to plus in your hand at that point too. Just very useful to be having a healthy hand size. But I also didn't want to play 4 copies because if you hard draw into him, he's a totally useless card. Unless you like discard him and then go into Legion. But then now that procs you more to even incentivize to go into more Legion turns instead of like a stride turn, which stride turns typically are better at the end of G era. 1 copy of the stride fodder. So again, this deck focuses on going stride first to set up really well. So I just wanted to up the consistency of like pitching 1 card for stride. Other notable cards that you can play is Zoran, for example. This helps proc more superior calls too, to take advantage of Bruno, cheer up Trumpeter, but also the grade 2 Bernarius as I mentioned too. So that's where you would have to take the ratios if you want that maybe to shine more too as well. I personally felt like superior calling to hopefully get something may not pay you forward as you wish to sometimes, and it could also just cause resources that at that point you were better off doing something else essentially. Onto the zeros. So our starter is Koal. So he is the GB1 starter. As long as you have Unite, you can act, put this into your soul, check top 3 and call something and it gets 2k and this card shuffles. You'll notice that most Liberator cards will just bottom deck and then cards like these will shuffle your deck, which is helpful because more than likely you're going to grab a unit and then maybe some triggers get bottom deck. That's always not the best feeling, but cards like this help shuffle the deck so that way now your triggers are shuffled essentially. You could play the Legion starters as well, or even like some old school Gold Paladin starters too. The Legion starters though, again, if you're not really going into Legion immediately, and if you can because you need 4 cards in the drop zone to do so, those cards just stay on the field and they're useless. They're just 5k boosters, and if you're susceptible to also like retirement later on with other strides too, those can easily be get rid of before you get the like full value at that point too. So you're better off with Koal too. You may not use this on first stride, you may save it to like the next stride turn. It really just depends on your situation, but again, you can use this to add another superior call to make your Bruno columns bigger too. To further up the power of your Vanguard columns, whether it be Gurguit Helios, your first stride, or even your Prominence Glares, is Cheer Up Trumpeter. So what is this card? This could also be your starter too, but I put this in the main deck so you can just have these on board, shove them into Soul, and then your Vanguard gets the red text where it gets 3k for every card it sees called from the deck. Very similar to Bruno essentially, but this time it's on the Vanguard. So if you're worried about like maybe your back row getting like attacked by maybe let's say Nubatama with their Domination G-Guard or a Cannoneer with Night Rose, you could at least count on this just in case if you need to really push hard still with your Vanguard column. This is also a Liberator target, so you could just call it from a superior call into 5k booster. But if you also hard draw into this is a 10k shield too. So it's actually not bad because it's 10k shield. Furthermore, it adds to the soul, so this makes it a lot easier to soul blast, especially if you're relying on cards such as like Regulation Liberator and then of course Josephus. Onto the triggers, we are playing 4 effect crits. This basically, as your superior calling, there's going to be some viable targets, and there's some targets that are like, okay, I need to like chain further, but also I need to get some resources. And this is what's cool when you have triggers with effects. And so this lets you basically check the top 4 for a Bluish Flame card and add it to your hand if you do. The other thing that is it returns itself to deck too. So just having a crit that goes back to deck is super vital, especially with a Paladin deck. Since you're technically decked inning effectively, crits and stand triggers being able to go back by themselves is super appreciated. Cannot stress that. We also have 4 more crit for more pressure. Again, you're decked inning, you also want to make sure that your Vanguard attack is also just as lethal too. If you're going so big and making it harder for your opponent to guard, you sometimes just steal wins that way too. So having 8 crit at least for that pressure is definitely vital. You got a boy Catch Goal. He's a stand trigger, but also just being able to superior call him to continue chain calling. He can call anything except for himself essentially, and he shuffles the deck as well. Again, super helpful, just being able to shuffle your triggers back normally. And again, it goes back to deck too. And then this is also great to be able to call and then like discard or like guard with, and then eventually like just Legion stuff back, especially triggers. And it makes your deck also think twice about like guarding that turn because you just return 4 triggers more than likely as well. For the Liberator countercharge heal, this is awesome because around this time, Gold Paladin just got the heal that lets him countercharge or soul charge essentially, and 9 times out of 10 you are going to countercharge because you value the counterblast a lot in this deck. It's also a Liberator too, so you could call it worst case with your Liberator cards if need to. Onto the strides, and so 1 copy of Solemn Glitter because that's really all you need. You really need that first stride to do something in the sense, and this helps you basically do like what Oath Liberator does or like Holy Flame does on first stride, but you just call 2 from that top 3. That also activates Unite, so you can use your GB1 starter to like fix your field a little bit better too. You can make better numbers too if you already have an existing Bruno already, so that's like 2 to 3 superior calls right off the back pretty easily without committing too much. This lets you build a field for free without committing cards from hand as well. That's also very important to maintain advantage and be able to survive for the next turn, but also just be able to push back later on with key cards that you may need. And one of your power strides is Gurguit Helios. So again, discard, act, Unite, you persona flip, and you get an extra drive for the turn. This can be done technically on first stride too, worst case scenario. You could also on your GB3 turn, essentially when this attacks, it gets 5k for every regard that you have, and also your opponent cannot guard with grade 1s or greater. Again, this is very beefy on its own, so you don't necessarily need a beefed up Bruno column booster essentially, but that helps. It makes crazy numbers over 50k, 60k, and again, triggers are 5k only. You got 10k triggers as shield, you got 5k shield, so G-Guards can only get so big unless they have like Negronora or like the Royal Paladin one that searches for a perfect guard. It's really hard to guard this essentially. It always put my opponents, especially in the tournament that I played too, it basically made my opponents like think twice or like sweat. It's like, oh, I hope he doesn't get too many crits or he doesn't get any crits so I can survive. and you run 4, so you can go into it twice. You can also not persona flip and technically go into Helios multiple times turn by turn. But in this day and era, you may be able to survive to a second, third stride turns most typically, so you have no fear of persona flipping immediately at that point. We have Ultima just in case. Also, again, Liberators have access to this, so why not? And you have cards that search for your grade 3 Bluish Flame, so you have some fodder there. We have Radiant Sword Gurguit as well, just to have some power columns. This is a very niche case scenario, so I just threw it in there, but it has not come up, so you can put something else if you want. Other niche scenarios, so we have Spirit Cross Dragon, so this is in case like your field's retired, you got nothing, you really don't have much in hand, and it's better to do a Spirit Cross, especially if you already have cards face up in the G zone already. So you could essentially call full board potentially from this and have a comeback, essentially. That's really what it is for. You also have Glorious Reigning Dragon too, sort of similar, but you do 1, you need Unite, and 2, you need to bottom deck 2 rear guards to be able to do the skill fully at that point too. It's also one of those cards where like if you feel like you wanted some resource back, you can do that because he's able to counter charge and soul charge as well. That's helpful too. But if you feel like also just multi-attack is better than beefing up your comms and hoping that you have 3 attacks with maybe a stand trigger in the mix, this might be the go-to stride as well. You have 2 Slamies. This is really good. It returns some key pieces that you may want to return, but it also helps you get some shield fodder. Also worth noting, like I said, like with triggers and grade 1s and grade 2s being smaller too, you check your top 5 and you call 2 different grades, right? And so your highest shield, if you think about it, are your triggers, which are 10k, and then the next best thing is your 5k. So really this gets as big as 30k shield on top of that. So now you can start like reflecting like, okay, that's not as big as modern day Vanguard essentially too, right? And so that's why even certain decks have trouble with guarding just what you're trying to do. You have Elise as well, just having some options in the G-Guard, 1 copy of Rail too, just in case you really just need to throw it down there, not enough shield, and also you have Screw. You also want to make sure that you have like Generation Break 3 if you know your opponent got first strike too, so if you're able to selectively G-Guard with some of these and then go into Gurguit Helios, and then when you flip with it, you'll be GB3 as well.
Right, grade 1, call it to the rigor column, take damage, draw for turn. In this case, since you're going first, you want to win first strike still. So stay at grade 1, call something. If you have a Bruno, you can call it behind Vanguard immediately. Attack for 9, attack, drive check. They attack you, take a damage, maybe guard with another card, draw for turn. This time you could write grade 2, call this Aglovale, scale. You could do catch call to power up more Bruno, and then eventually maybe get another booster like Bruno. This can attack. You could attack with Vanguard in case you get a stand trigger or a trigger, a critical trigger, like we did. Then this, they write to grade 3, you could intercept, guard with something. Let's say they attack one of your rear guards, draw, write grade 3. In this case, you have to pitch 2, stride, Solemn Glitter, all 2 cards. You could do it this way. Josephus, So Bless the Liberator, draw a card. The Bruno see it. If you want to further extend, you can use Call, but I'll save it. This can attack, 16. Vanguard with a 13k booster, triple drive, power and crit, wherever applies, attack. Let's say you take some damage, you're guarded, stand and draw. You can stride, Gurguit Helios. You can call over cards to trigger Unite. You can use Call to further get more power for Brunos. Get another booster. You can do from rear guard to Vanguard with quad check, no grade 1s or greater. 2 crits, apply where it makes sense, and then attack like that. Remember, he gets also 25k on top of that. And that's the deck profile, Mios. Hope you enjoyed it too. It's a blast from the past, you know, Explosion Blue. I don't know, I just like Gold Paladins over the years too. I think they're fun, and really Bluish Flames for me was the one that got me into it the most. I picked it up during G era, funny enough. I actually could have picked it up during Legion era, but I was more focused on Genesis with Idriso, and then of course, eventually G era started. Like Legion era was not that long, to be honest. To talk about more of G format too, if you're interested in playing G format, essentially G Reboot as a server is an online community. This is not run by Bushiroad whatsoever, so it's literally community based. And so it's much as people can help out and also just be able to participate in the monthly tournaments. In June, we are taking a break for it. May's tournament actually bleeded into June a little bit too. But it is flexible. Each round is actually a couple days, so then players can actually plan a time and day where they can actually play out the rounds. It's best 2 out of 3 too, so if you liked having those best 2 out of 3 game formats like we did in the past too, definitely check it out for yourself. There's a modified ban list, and again, I'll put it on the screen as well so you can look at that too. And they're always keeping an eye in just in case like somebody brings something like crazy and then there's obviously some power creep that needs to be addressed. They're more than being open-minded to it as well. You gotta also play proxies too, so if you don't have these cards or like, I can't even get these cards because they're so old. So you could play proxies too. So just let Caleb know in the tournament as well, and your opponents as well, and they're more than happy to like, oh, okay, that's what that card is. I'll show off some like previous like months that you've seen like the top 4. He goes out of his way to make like the top 4
decks that win in those monthly tournaments too. And as you can see, it's a variety of differences. And you may see like here a meta deck or two from like the past too. But as you can see, there's a lot of variety. And that's the whole point of this G format server, is to like really have fun with a variety of decks too. And it's not just become like this one deck beats all everything kind of thing. And again, massive shout out to Caleb and anybody that's still contributing with the server. Thanks to you. You guys are basically keeping it as an option and alive, essentially. And there's more in the server, actually. There's other legacy formats too, such as Legion era and also like Limerick era too. They just started those as well, and people have interest. There's an expansion format that like essentially it's a what if G era continued kind of scenario. Like if V series happened, what would happen to G era if we continued on with it, right? There's no actual tournaments for this, but there's like more custom made cards. It uses arts from like existing cards in like V series and modern day Vanguard, and also like even Buddy Fight, and maybe some custom art too. I'm not 100% sure, but essentially there's some cool mechanics that they're trying to introduce in the expansion set where it just makes it like a what if G era scenario. Maybe in the future too, they'll make it where like basically each clan has enough of this support where it just makes sense to start making tournaments too online as well. In July, there will be the next G format tournament. So if you want to like prep ahead of time and also sign up for it too, there's plenty of time for that. More than likely, I'll be signing up for July as well. But this time, I'm not playing Gold Paladin. I'm excited to bring something that I didn't get the chance to really explore at the end of G era as well for next month's tournament as well. On to the next one, amigos. Bye!